So I'm going to talk to you guys about swatting bugs and keeping your data clean. Now, I'm not sure why we're talking about these two specific topics together, because the first one is really quite easy. It usually requires a fly swatter, and that's how you swat bugs. That was funny. Come on. I was told that may not work. This is the second way you can also swat bugs. So we're going to talk about debugging. This is going to be a pretty quick presentation. I know we're kind of late into this entire series of presentations that you guys have been sitting through. But I think it's actually pretty interesting to think about debugging and actually come up with some strategies because it can make your time developing in Creator a whole lot less painful if you have some good strategies. So, of course, you guys know debugging is just the process of finding and preventing scripting errors. This is going to be a refresher for basically everyone here. So, just kind of keep that in mind where we're going to be kind of high level here. The most important thing that I think when it comes to debugging is just testing early and often. I find so many problems occur when people are getting a little bit ahead of themselves. You guys already know this, but it's good to kind of have that refresher. So just test early and often, have a good idea of exactly what command or what function you're working on at that time, what workflow, and that way it kind of helps to narrow down exactly where those errors can occur. So we're going to go through some examples, and I'll talk about some different ways specifically in Creator how you can debug. Of course, there's these two specific expressions, alerts, right, to pop up on the screen, and then you can use info when you are testing within codes. You guys know about both these functions? Yes? Excellent. All right. So let's just take a look at some different examples and see if we can find what some of these errors are. So this is just a quick example of what all these expressions are. They hold values. These are some ways that you can write them as an equation with underscores, within double quotes for strings. Now, Creator reads one line at a time. I'm sure most of you guys know this, but just make sure that your equations or any type of processing happens after you've collected all of the data that you may need, right? So if you have some user input, that needs to be, of course, taken into account before those actual equations go. Now, so does the placement of info and alert matter? It definitely does, right? And then, of course, when you need to write comments, you can do both the double slash, or you can actually use /* to do multiple line comments. So some common errors inside of Creator and how to fix them. So this is a really basic one, dynamic hiding. So let's say you need to create some type of logic statement that says, if someone selects this, then show that statement, right? If someone selects this, show the other one. Now, if you do this incorrectly, oftentimes it can lead to a whole bunch of problems, right? Like a really stupid robot that falls over. But let's say you were actually just creating this basic script, right? So execute if it's a yes or no radio dial. If the service equals yes, then show the first field, which is note 1. If they say no, then show the second field. Now, a really cool thing when I was just messing around with Creator is that when you use the script builder, when you use the actual workflow builder, Creator will automatically hide relevant fields. So before, I'd have to actually, in Creator 4, I'd have to go in and put in like a hide statement for that particular field. Now, in Creator 5, it just won't show fields note 1 and note 2. So it's really nice. And I'll actually show you just this example program that I have. Not there. Here it is. All right, so real super basic program. Are you happy with our service? Yes, you're awesome. Here's a cookie. No, who asked you anyway? The hiding of those statements is done automatically. So you just want to make sure that the logic behind your yes and no statements is pretty clear, right? Really basic stuff. We'll get into some stuff that's a little bit more interesting in just a second. So with that, you have a really cool robot that can handle all of these user errors. Now, what happens when a variable is not defined, right? So there's different things to look for, right? Again, real basic stuff, but just make sure that your spelling is consistent. Sometimes people overlook basic stuff here. Sometimes you can have inconsistent capitalization, or you might forget to declare a variable at all before you actually use it. So in this case, quantity was spelled incorrectly. And so that's one of the errors that caused that statement to fail. Now, how many people have gotten this and is like, oh, there's a semicolon? I know, I get it. This is obviously one of those error messages that really can make you very upset. We'll talk about what some of those things can actually mean. Of course, the very basic stuff, you might actually have a missing semicolon, which would be pretty funny. But sometimes you may have an extra semicolon. So can anyone here tell me where the error is? You look at it real quick. Yes. Line 4, excellent. So there's an extra semicolon there. The if statement doesn't have a semicolon before the curly brace. All right, so of course other basic things to look for, right? Missing operators in this case, or you have an unclosed parenthesis, so we have both of those here, and we'll put those together. Now, another thing to note, right, so when you start developing with Creator, sometimes you don't know some of the specific rules, but you cannot start a variable name with a number, right? I think many people know that, but sometimes you try that, you run into problems. Just be advised, that's not something you're able to do. Also, variable names must be fully connected, so you have to have an underscore, cannot have a space in line 2. And you might have some operating errors on the side of the client. So let's actually just take a look at some of the different types of errors you can have. So one of those is when you're building your program, just remember that null is not the same thing as 0, right? Sometimes you run into problems where you leave a field blank and you try to do some type of calculation based on that blank field, assuming that it should be 0, but in fact it's null, and we'll actually take a look at a problem that you might run into. And when we look at some of these, so this is the specific kind of case that I'll show you. But here, let's say we have a really basic field that I created. I'll show you that same field again. And let's say we're asking the user for a quantity, and then we're also asking them for a price. And we're going to actually multiply that and give them the total. Now, the issue is that we'll put in a really basic script that says, OK, just multiply this and put it in total. And we'll do it as the user is filling in the information on the form, right? So it's not a submit, it's inline. And we're going to run into an error. And the reason we're going to run into an error is that the program's trying to do this calculation before it gets all of the pieces. And so it's doing a null calculation. So let me show you what that looks like. So we'll go back to our form real quick. So this is that real basic form we created. And so here, let's actually just go ahead and try to put in an amount. So we'll just put 1, and we'll put a quantity. And so there we go, I got an error. And the reason I got an error is because, again, it's trying to run both the multiplication. So when you get these errors, don't just freak out, because they actually do have quite a bit of meaning inside of them. So you can see that it's saying it's on user input, and it was on the field amount. OK, that makes sense. Now, the error is found in line 1. This line is actually talking about the script. So we're going to go back and take a look at the script. And then the last one, it even tells you that it was while you were performing some type of multiplication calculation. So all right, let's go take a look at this. So we'll go back and we'll go down. And so this is that error that we got. And now if we actually go look at the code, so the top one is what I originally had. And so it's actually just doing the multiplication right away. And what I realized is you actually need to put in some exception handling, right? You need to actually say, well, if the other one is null, right, don't run this yet, right? Don't run this calculation yet. Or you can substitute it for 0 in that case. And so those are just some things that you kind of have to actually take a look at. So on the first one, you'll actually notice that it was on line 1. So the error message does, in fact, tell you exactly where you need to look. So let's actually go ahead and see how we handle this. So now, instead, right, you saw the code where I put the exception to be handled, so we'll just put 5, and now no error message, the total is still 0, I'll put 10, and then now this should change automatically, right? So we didn't run into that bug there because we made sure that we went back and made the change as needed. So that was one of the main points there. Now, as we continue, we'll start to look for just some avoiding different operational errors. So make sure that you use conditionals to check for null values, right? The way that we just did on that example. So make sure you actually use those to make sure that you're not doing any of those calculations with null. And then only run the equations when you have all of that data entered. And finally, you can add more fields and then use different conditions for that single statement as well. So if you need to add an else, if you need to make this any more complex, you can definitely do so. So in this case, maybe we want to create an alert that actually lets them know, please fill in a price, right? This will pop up on the screen. So you can actually create these different types of exception handles inside of your application. Now let's take a look at some different argument mismatches. So if you're using some of the functions that are within Creator, so let's say at the top we're looking at this replace all function. The reason we're getting an error is that we actually haven't given it all of the information that it needs. So you do have to remember that when an argument is passed, it's actually passing that expression into the function. So we need to actually, at the bottom, you'll see you need to include embarrass there to actually let it know what that change is. And when you are using any of those built-in functions, make sure that the spelling is correct, right? Sometimes you'll run into errors. Refer back to the user guide for Creator. So in this case, the issue in this specific instance is that it's missing the S on get minutes. So real basic stuff, but again, these are some of the things you have to take a look at when you are debugging. So converting data types, this is really important if you're going to be using pretty much any of the data that a user enters into the program. So one of the issues is that when you're converting from different data types, you can only convert in certain directions. So for example, an integer can go to a decimal, right? But a decimal cannot go to an integer, right? It actually makes sense logically. You can have something that's more general go to something more specific, but if you try to go the other way around, something from more specific, something that has more detailed, you cannot go to the more general function. So in that case, use the actual functions that are listed inside of Creator to do those changes. It just makes that process quite a bit easier. So in this case, you have these two string functions, to date, to time, to decimal, and to long. So you can actually convert to each of those. So very useful to actually just have kind of a quick reference of some of these different conversions. And for example, when you have some text that a user is entering, typically any type of like text field or field box is going to be a string, right? So if you're going to have to make any changes to that, you really want to convert that to the appropriate type of format that you need. So in this case, can anyone tell me what the error is that we're running into here, or why it's running into an error? So it's an input, right? The user is entering in a rating, and I'm not able to, and it's actually telling me it's error at line 1. Right, so the issue that I'm getting is that it's an input mismatch. I actually need to convert that to an appropriate type of format. So I need to convert it to a long so that it actually understands what greater than 4 is, right? Because it's just looking at some string and trying to make that greater than 4. It's not going to be able to do that. So make sure that you're actually using the built-in functions for the conversions. It'll just save you a lot of time, make this process quite a bit easier. Now, just some general best practices. Right? Make sure to leave lots of comments. Make sure that when you actually write a specific part of your program, that you leave comments almost so that someone else who has no idea what you're writing actually could read it and figure out what it is. Because a lot of times when I work on programs, I'll come back to it and I'll realize, like, hey, what was I thinking? Like, it was probably 3 a.m. and I wrote this. I don't even know what's actually happening here. Right? So the more comments you write at that time, it seems tedious, but programmers really do have to have a good level of communication skills to accurately convey what's happening. So just some basic things to keep in mind. And use info statements and have some descriptions as far as what they're used for. So if you're using them multiple times, give yourself a description of exactly what you're looking to happen with that specific info statement. So I know, again, a lot of this is a refresher, but sometimes it's better to hear it so that you actually can go back and use some of these best practices. So another thing to do is use input.field name instead of just field name to separate your fields from variables. And then, of course, if you're using any type of code repeatedly, right, you probably want to put those into some type of function so that you can call that function again. This is something to practice. It definitely becomes much more usable to actually just refer back to a function than having to write that again and again and again. So definitely use that. And there's actually a whole functions tab inside of Creator. You can create those outside of script and call them. I definitely recommend using them. Using consistent naming schemes. So whether you're using Pascal casing, camel casing, you're using underscores, just be consistent so that you know what it is you're referring to when you are actually creating those different variables. I also recommend having a descriptive name. Short variable names seem good in the short run, but when you are actually going back to debug, right? It becomes an issue when I'm not really sure where this is going, right? The longer your programs get, the more complicated they get.